We need to think about principles or ecological principles that are going to help as the foundation of our food forest. So the main ecological principle of a natural forest are that influencing the productivity of food forest ecosystems. So what are these? Well, climate. What climate you're in is going to dictate what you can grow. So for instance, if I'm in the tropics here, it's going to be very easy for me to grow tropical things and much more difficult for me to grow temperate things. So if I have a desire because I come from North America and I want to eat temperate food all the time, but I want to live in Thailand, you think that's going to be easy? Would it be cheap to not change to eat Thai food, for instance? If I don't like to eat Thai food, then I'm always having to buy food. It's going to be very expensive, right? So we need to understand the climate is going to dictate what we grow. The forest structure, so temperate, deciduous, or versus tropical. The structure of the forest is going to dictate the planting spacing. In a tropical nature, our trees are very close together. They can be very, very tight, a very closed forest because we have such a high sun angle. So the sun angle is at 85 degrees and the sun can come in and reach more of the floor, so the trees can be tighter. But when you're in a temperate climate, right, the sun angle is very low. So the angle of the sun does not allow the sunlight to come in, so the trees are spaced further apart, okay? So this is something when you're designing, you have to understand your climate or your hemisphere, where are we at in the world, our latitudes and longitudes, so that we can design the spacing of our trees. We need to understand sunlight and shade, because if we close our canopy, we won't be able to grow any vegetables underneath. And a lot of times when people are describing in permaculture a food forest, it also has vegetables, what we might find. So when we went into our food forest and we looked and we could see that there was lemongrass, right? And we're able to harvest the lemongrass, we're able to eat it, right? But if we have the trees too close together, they will take all the sunlight and we won't be able to grow any of our vegetables on the ground layer, right? So the relationship to the spacing of your trees is going to dictate the relationship of fruit to vegetables. So how much fruit do I have and how many vegetables do I have? That's a spacing relationship. We need to understand water. We don't want to provide water. So in a food forest, we don't want to really have to do anything. We want to plant trees that can take care of themselves. So I don't have an irrigation system. So as I said, I have 8 months, it doesn't really rain, but I don't irrigate my food forest. I plant trees that are native to take care and survive this drought period. So in the 4 months of good water, they grow really fast, make great mangoes, right? All water, right? But in the other time period, it just sits there. It's dormant. It's like winter, right? So I want to look at things that are tolerant of my water conditions. What about wind? If we have a really big wind event, so maybe I live next to the ocean, for instance, and I'm worried about wind, then I can pick trees to be on the outer edge of my food forest that are more wind tolerant, or even salt tolerant. If I'm next to the ocean, I need salt tolerant windbreaks. I can look at the soil. I want to work on the soil if it's very poor, but I also need to understand that through the chop and drop regime of my food forest, it's going to create the soil conditions. So a forest creates its own nutrient cycling. I don't have to add fertilizer. And all of these nutrient cycles, with the advent of my choice, I can chop and drop. If I work in my food forest, I get higher production, meaning that I prune my trees, I move the nutrients, and I will increase the production. If I don't work in my food forest, it doesn't die. It just sits there. It may have a lower production level, right? So these are choices I can make. Would anybody like to be able to go on a vacation? So you're going to design a system. And for instance, does anyone have a garden and you go away for 2 months and you come back and nobody worked in your garden? What does it look like? Dead. Nothing there. Nobody watered it. Nobody weeded it. Nothing. But if I go away for 2 months and I come back to my food forest, what does it look like? Identical. It's like, that's it. I put those things in their natural environment and that's what they do. If I'm there or not, it's not really important anymore. So we want to think about that aspect of designing to a natural ecosystem that can support itself. Nature is very resilient. That natural ecosystem doesn't really need us. For sure, we have a point or a place in nature, but the real question is, what is our place? Is our place fighting weeds all the time, pulling weeds and doing this, or is our place to be harvesting? I think that if I think about the Garden of Eden, I don't really think that Adam and Eve were going around pulling weeds. Well, who knows? The fungi layer is super important. It's moving those nutrients, remember? So it's cycling nutrients, so we can also work on that. The chop and drop, so we chop, we prune our trees, we place the mulch to create ground covers and mulch. That's going to increase that fungal network. We need to also realize that we have an obligation as a steward, because I don't think I really own Raktamachat. How can I own land? Really? If I leave here, I want to go to CQ to do something, I put it in my back pocket and I carry it with me? No, not really. So while I'm here, I can steward it, I can make decisions. My decisions make a difference to the biodiversity that's on this property. That's really what I'm doing. So when my food forest, I have to also remember it provides habitat. So what lives in your food forest? Do you have bees, right? You need bees for pollination. Any other beneficial insects? Would you like to have frogs? Would you like to have newt that could eat snails? Would you like your ducks to live in your food forest so they could eat the snails so I don't have to fight snails, right? These are things that I can do, and I can provide habitat. So if I do all of these things, I will speed up the succession of a natural ecosystem. It will develop faster. So my food forest that you guys walked in, that's only 3 years old. Okay? So those trees are 3 years old. And in 3 years, and making that much. That's pretty fast development, right? So we can speed it up. We work with our nursery, we work with our soils, we take care of the tree in its infancy, and that once it gets to that adolescent stage, that it starts to fruit, it can take care of itself. I don't need to do anything else. And think about native, and also you can put in exotic plants, but remember, an exotic plant is going to take more work. You're going to have to interact with it, and the yields, for sure, if it's not in its native environment, are not going to be very good. So is it worth it for you to try to put in energy messing with exotic plants when you could have a native plant that would give you a lot better yield? This is a question of your design. And nitrogen fixing plants are very important in permaculture. We understand that nitrogen being one of the most important aspects of food development because it's for size, okay? It's like in, well, if we were to say human nutrition, it's protein. Don't eat any protein and see what happens. Don't get very big, right? Eat more protein, you get more big. So nitrogen is super important, and nitrogen fixating trees have a relationship, right, with a symbiosis relationship with a bacteria in the soil. So they can fix nitrogen from the soil. They make their own fertilization. So if we utilize these in a chop and drop regime, we feed the nitrogen fixing tree, which is a legume. The legumes are what are called pioneer species. A pioneer species is in the development of a forest. It's the first trees that come. It's not the long-term trees. It's not the what we call mature trees or old growth. Those are not legumes, okay? Those are hardwoods. Legumes come first, and they create and they fix the soil. So they're fixing nitrogen, and they're creating the humic that the long-term trees in the succession. So if we can plant legumes, they grow really fast, they're really aggressive, but they're very short-term. Legumes don't live very long. So we use legumes to grow, to create biomass, to feed to our, for instance, in a designer forest, fruit trees. So I grow this tree to feed to this tree, right? That's how I get my fertilization regime. We need to understand the time for growth. So later, when we're doing our design side of this discussion, we're going to see how trees grow in what's called an expanding polyculture. So I'm going to create a design. I'm going to pick the trees, but I need to understand the spatial relationships that happen over time. And I also need to understand, I need time to harvest. So how much time do you have? Certain types of trees would require more time and or equipment, right? Maybe they're too tall. Maybe I'm not able to get that, right? So these are type of things that we pick the tree that we want based on our time. So some ecological principles. Precise positions of the sun for the whole year round. Super important when we start to lay out our forest that we know the height of the tree, right? So that when we space the trees, we have a relationship to a sun angle. So as the sun is high and low, it makes shadow, right? And that shadow, or the casting of shadow, is going to affect our production. So the yield of your food forest is related directly to the spacing between the trees that you choose. So first we have to know the tree we want, then we have to know its mature height so that we can calculate, it's a very simple calculation, the distance between these two trees. Because when they're really small, they look small, right? Just a little seedling. Oh, why don't we put them really close together, right? But when they get big, they're going to fight. So what happens is their canopies are going to overlap, and they fight with each other for space, and they lower the yield of fruit. So we want to maximize the yields of fruit and our vegetables by doing that. We want to have a security for the biodiversity in our region. As I said, if I take on the concept of being a steward, of being at this property, being able to take a responsibility to steward the land, to rebuild the biodiversity, to understand that before there was cornfields here, right? There was a jungle. But what was in that jungle? Only fruit? No. Anybody been walking in the jungle? You see many fruit trees? Anybody been in a temperate climate? You walk in the forest? You see many fruit trees? No. They put the army, they go say, hey, here's 2 weeks, go stay in that forest, see if you can survive. Here's a jungle, we're going to drop you off. You got 2 weeks, see if you can survive. Jungle training. It's not much food. So in a designer forest, we have to appreciate, well, if we go around and we find all the different fruit trees that are around the world and we bring them together, then we can have a forest that's going to meet our needs. What are the needs that we're designing for? Okay? So that'll secure biodiversity within that region. We have good design, which means we understand the canopy layer. We have to understand that, or the sunlight will be dispersed and we won't be able to have our yields. We need to provide sufficient space for plant roots. We have to still realize that some trees have different root systems, and if you put them too close together, the roots will actually fight. And if this tree's root fights with this tree root underground, the yields will be lowered. So maybe we're not getting actually enough because of that. And total surface area. How many acres or square meters do you have? If you try to put too many trees in too small a place, you may not get any yield. You have a lot of trees, isn't that nice, but I don't have any food. And we're going to use those nitrogen fixers.